On today's show, I speak to Clive Stafford Smith, a human rights lawyer from England who has represented numerous clients on death row in America. Additionally, has helped victims of the so-called war in terror, including clients who have undergone extraordinary rendition, illegal detention, and torture. This is your host, Umar, and welcome to the Ozone Podcast. Hello, Clive Stafford Smith. Welcome to the Ozone Podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and I think maybe we could start by you telling a little bit about your background.
Oh my goodness, where do you want me to start? I was born in Cambridge in the UK, and so the beginning of my life was all there, and everyone wanting you to do well at science and become a scientist and sort of things. And that's what I did in school, was just all these sciences. And I never wanted to do that. I was boring. I wanted to go and battle the death penalty in America. I saw something when I was about 12 about the English burning Joan of Arc at the stake. And in my history book, Joan of Arc looked a lot like my sister Mary. And, I may have my difference with my sister, but I don't want her burnt at the stake. I just thought this was mad. And then I wrote something when I was 16, which I thought was a history project about the death penalty. And I discovered that the US was still doing it. I was really shocked. So obviously, as a sort of arrogant young privileged white male, I thought, oh, I'll come and sort America out and get them to stop this death penalty nonsense. So I came over to the US age 19, 18 or just about 19, and went to university there and was going to write the seminal book that was going to convince everyone of the error of their ways. And I did write a book, not anything that was going to have that grandiose result, but discovered that people in the richest place on earth on death row had no right to a lawyer. And I thought that was bizarre. So I thought even I could figure out they needed a lawyer more than a bad book. So I went to law school and then went and did death penalty work for 41 years now. I haven't quite won the battle yet, but I think we're getting the right direction.
So that's interesting. Just out of curiosity, when was the death penalty abolished in the UK, or did they ever have one?
In 1965, it was abolished. And it was abolished primarily because of a series of people being hanged who turned out to be innocent. And of course, we've had a lot more than that in America. And one of my projects right now actually is to review the 1,602 people who've been executed since 1977, when the US effectively restarted to look at who was innocent. And it shocks me. We're running at about a little over 200 cases, 82 of which are in Texas, by the way, unsurprisingly. And the evidence of innocence on these guys is incredibly compelling. So I hope one of these days we'll convince people that human beings are fallible and that we just shouldn't engage in that sort of thing.
Why do you think the US still has the death penalty? Is it something because of the system? Are the people too bloodthirsty? Like, why does this exist in 2025 in the US?
It's for the same reason that all of these mad things are coming up under our current president, which is that when you've got serious problems, you've got two choices. You can either do something sensible about it, which sometimes takes a lot of work and takes a lot of time, or you can just lie to people. So with the death penalty, we say, we execute 2 or 3 young black men and that'll solve our manifest problems with crime, with drugs, with lack of education, with lack of healthcare, with lack of everything. And of course, that's a total lie and it has no impact. But it's the same thing behind Guantanamo Bay, that there's this horrendous thing happens on 9/11. And we think somehow we're going to solve that by locking up a bunch of Muslim men and giving them no legal rights. It's just those lies and all these populist things that people do, that certain politicians do, are just ways of evading their responsibility. And it's easy to sell hatred, I'm afraid.
Speaking of Guantanamo Bay, I know you were one of the lawyers who first went down there to help out in some of those cases. Can you tell me like how you ended up going down there and what was that experience like? Because I know it's quite extensive for yourself.
Yeah. I was, when 9/11 happened, it's truly shocking. It was a dreadful thing. But, I was born and raised in Europe, and we've invaded each other every other year for the last millennium. And I underestimated America's incredible emotional response because when you think about it, the US territorially has really only been invaded like three times. And that's the War of 1812, obviously December the 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor, and then 9/11. And so the emotional response was phenomenal. The idea that we'd establish Guantanamo, and this was some way a good thing to do, I was horrified. And you have to remember, in the early days, every single person in Guantanamo was facing the death penalty. So when that came up, I thought, wow, this is just stupid and it's going to cause massive problems for America. So let's sue George Bush. I mean, what could be more fun than that? So I thought everyone would want to do it. And I called around my death penalty friends, and none of them wanted to do it. Everyone was so shell shocked. And so it was really hard. And in the end, I found a friend of mine, Joe Margulis, and then Michael Ratner at CCR were the only people who would do it. And so we sued on February the 19th, 2002, in Rasul versus Bush. And three original clients were British people. We needed to find people who we could represent. And so we sued that day. And again, I thought, we're just doing what we're sworn to do, which is uphold the US Constitution. You can't have a prison where people have no right. You can't do these things. I unwisely agreed to go on American television to defend what we were doing that day, because the others didn't want to do it. And I thought, no, we've got to stand up for what we're doing. So I went on this news program on one of your well-known news stations, and I got accused of being a traitor to America 13 times in a 5-minute interview. And I tell you, the death threats I got after that were quite something. But, it was really the right thing to do. And while Europeans will pretend that they were always against it, they weren't. And in the early days, it was very hard to get any support. But I think, tell me I'm wrong, but I think that we basically won that battle, which I think is a fabulous trip. I got down there it took us 2.5 years to win in the Supreme Court. And one thing you've got to give America that Britain doesn't have and a lot of these other countries don't have is that US Constitution is a fabulous tool when you're trying to do justice. We had a conservative Supreme Court who didn't like our clients, but they had to do the right thing. And particularly right after those pictures came out in Abu Ghraib, where you began to see the truth. I mean, even I didn't believe that the CIA was up to that stuff. And it was shocking to see what they were doing. But I think that's what tipped the Supreme Court over the edge. And they then ordered that we be allowed to go there. Now, there are 780 people there meant to be the worst of the worst of the worst terrorists in the world. And they've let go 765. And to do that, we have to convince everyone that these people are no threat to anyone. And so they've had it wrong in 94.8% of the cases by their own standard. And, this is a true example of the big lie. The idea that Guantanamo was really doing anything positive for America. What it did do, and this was said by an intelligence agent back in 2004 when we were first there, who said that because we're behaving like such total hypocrites, saying that we're here to teach the world about democracy and the rule of law, but we're going to begin by putting a bunch of bearded Muslim men in Guantanamo, deny them any law and anything. That hypocrisy is what breeds hatred. And this intelligence agent said, I think for each of the 780 prisoners in Guantanamo, we've probably provoked 10 people to hate America and want to blow themselves up and do dreadful things to us. And that was 2004. I think if you look back at the reality of the number of people who was on that list that was taken from Osama bin Laden when we killed him, of the entire membership of Al Qaeda in 2001, which was like 120 people. And you now look at the number of people who wish us harm. I don't approve of that. I think it's awful that they do that. But I do think a large amount of the hatred has been inspired by our actions in terms of just being hypocritical and violating our own norms. So, it's our job to stand up for those things. And, boy, we're going to have a job for the next 4 years, aren't we?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's pretty interesting that you went down there and you talked to these people in such a crazy environment. Before I talked to you, I watched this documentary that you were in, We Are Not Ghouls with Yvonne Ridley, and they were talking about one of the prisoners who was falsely ended up there and was being tortured. What was your experience like meeting those prisoners and knowing what they're going through? Like, I mean, I imagine even for someone like yourself with so much experience, it must have been a little bit shocking.
Honestly, speaking as an American, I didn't believe when it all started that we would be doing that stuff. I mean, we always know the CIA does some bad stuff, but it never occurred to me that they would have thrown out the entire Convention Against Torture. So then when I went down by the time I went to see, you're talking about Binyam Mohammed, one of my favorite clients, actually. I really like Binyam. A lovely sense of humor. He's sort of a British resident, originally from Ethiopia. And Binyam was thought by the CIA to be behind a nuclear bomb plot. And the nuclear bomb plot went like this. And sorry, may I ask you, Omar, how's your physics?
I used to know a lot more than I remember now, so I would say not that great, but okay.
Well, I'm going to test you, and I want you to tell me whether you think this would work. He was being interrogated about nuclear weapons, and he said, I don't know anything. And they abused him and abused him. And finally he said, well, I did see this video one time. I read this article, and it said how to build a nuclear bomb. What you do is you take your uranium and you put it in a bucket, right? And then you swing it around your head. That's called a centrifuge, apparently. And if you do that for 45 minutes, that divides up uranium 239 from uranium 235. Now you've got weapons grade uranium. Bob's your uncle. That's your nuclear bomb. How does that sound to you?
It doesn't sound like it would work.
It was total nonsense, right? I
Yeah.
was a physicist when I was younger, and I just thought, this is just a joke, right? So he tells me about this, and I Google it. And I discovered that was a spoof article written in 1972 by this woman in Florida. And it was just a joke. And so I tracked down her daughter. She was then the woman who wrote it was then, I think, in an old people's home. But the daughter worked for the LA Times, and she ended up writing an article about how my mom was behind the nuclear bomb plot. But all of this stuff was total madness. But the way it worked was like so many of these things that some, dare I say it, fool in the CIA heard that story. And, some of them, I'm sure, said, well, that's stupid. We don't need to believe that. But some people believed it. And so they relay it back to Washington. John Ashcroft, then the Attorney General of the United States, interrupts his visit to Moscow to say we've just solved a nuclear bomb plot by this guy, Benjamin Hamid. I couldn't get his name right. And then they end up taking him to Morocco to get more information, where they turned him over to our partners in Morocco, who took a razor blade to his genital every 2 weeks for a year and a half. And, obviously anyone would say anything at that point. And then he ends up being taken for more torture in the dark prison in Afghanistan, where they play incredibly loud music at him. They, sleep deprivation and torture and whatever. And Binyam, one of the things I liked about him was because he grew up in Britain, he knew all the songs. And, I always wanted to talk to Eminem about whether he wanted his songs used to torture people. But then I meet him in Guantanamo, and I spent 3 days talking to him, right? And at one point, Binyam said to me, I'm kind of dead in the head. You're going to have to fill in the emotion. And I was sitting there writing this stuff down. And I got to say, 3 days of this stuff. And I thought I had PTSD. And you can only imagine what poor old Binyam had gone through. And it turns out it's all rubbish. And in the end, he was charged in the military commission. And the film you're talking about, We Are Not Ghouls, is fortunately, and I think rightly, a film mainly about my military co-counsel, Yvonne Bradley. And Yvonne was, you know, I think I'm allowed to say this, was a Republican, African American, you know, fundamentalist Christian who totally believed in the American system. And when I first went down and took her to meet Binyam, she was really afraid of him. She really thought he was some terrible terrorist. And over the months that we did it, she came to really like him. And I'll never forget when, we were in front of this military commission. It was just total kangaroo court. And the judge couldn't really bully me because I wasn't a military officer. So he starts trying to bully her. And she is so standing up to him that and she was refusing to do what he said. And he was about to charge her. And, it's a death penalty offense for a US soldier not to do what a superior officer says. So I took the Fifth Amendment on Yvonne's behalf because I didn't want her getting, thrown out of the military. But all of this was just a joke. And the two military prosecutors at the time was a colonel and a lieutenant colonel, and they were very tough. And they started out very tough with all this death penalty stuff. And then they began to hear what had really happened. And I think they began to see the documentary evidence of what really happened. And to their immense credit, I mean, first they started off with the death penalty. They offered life in prison. They offered 20 years. And, I said, no, we're not doing that. And then they finally came to me and said they'd offer 1 day in prison if Binyam would just plead guilty and then they'd let him go back to England. And I said, look, guys, if you're going to do that, you're just going to let him go, right? So they just let him go because he didn't do what they said he did. And to their credit, both of those guys, they both quit the military and they both went public and said, this is not what America's about. They're not taking part in this process because it's just wrong. And I've seen quite a lot of that. I mean, of course, you see true believers in Guantanamo. I believe one of the presidential candidates in the last election at one point, one of the Republicans was there doing some stuff. And I'm not going to say that the governor of Florida is not a bit wayward when it comes to morality in the US Constitution. But there were a lot of people who did the right thing, a lot of soldiers who I came to have great respect for because, they didn't sign up for this sort of torture and abuse.
That's really interesting. I wanted to ask you about one of your more prominent clients, a case that you're working on right now, Aafia Siddiqui. Maybe we can talk a little bit about her background and what she's been charged with. I mean, it seems quite unusual that an MIT educated PhD from Brandeis, reading on her background, she came from a very educated family. I think her father was a physician, and now she's ended up in prison for many years. So maybe you can just kind of start with what she's been charged with, or like her story, and then we can go from there.
I mean, Omar, I think we have to start at the beginning.
Sure.
Look, I have now done probably 150 of the so-called war on terror cases, including 87 Guantanamo cases. And they've had some horrific facts, like Binyam's, things that really shocked me to the core. But nothing was like what happened to Aafia Siddiqui. And so, look, I got roped into it by her sister Fauzia only 2 years ago. And I'm sorry I didn't get involved before, to be honest. And let me say this about Fauzia Siddiqui. She is a doctor from Harvard. She's a neurologist, brilliant person. Never seen a human being do more for her sister than she has. And if you're ever in trouble, Emma, I advise you to have Fauzia as your sister. And she wrote me into doing this. And I was going to Texas anyhow, your neck of the woods there in Dallas, Fort Worth. And that's where Aafia is held, and she's in FMC Carswell. And I've been to pretty much every death row in America. I've been to Guantanamo 42 times. I have never seen a prison that abuses its prisoners like FMC Carswell. And I went to see Aafia, and she was so tormented and so traumatized. And she told me about some of what had happened to her, and she told me she'd been raped in FMC Carswell and the abuse that was going on there. It was just shocking. So I took a case on, and then you start going back, and you're trying to work out how is it that the United States can think that this little 5'2" woman is some massive threat to US national security. And I've done this a lot of times over the years to try to work backwards, like with Binyam Mohammed. How did he become a nuclear bomb suspect to discover what these people thought? So this is what we now know. Aafia, yes, indeed, she went to MIT to do a degree, and then she did her PhD at Brandeis in education. And she was then married in one of those marriages that, it's cultural. It's not something I do, where she marries this guy, Amjad Khan, who was a doctor. And they got married by telephone, and it was a very unhappy marriage, and he was very abusive. And they were living in Massachusetts, in the Boston area. And at some point, right after 9/11, the authorities, the FBI comes by because turns out Amjad's been buying a bunch of books and some bulletproof, some night goggles and, some sort of bulletproof thing and all of this strange stuff. And it is actually, honestly, amazing they didn't just take him in right there because this was in the wake of 9/11. Everyone was pretty freaked out and a lot of Muslim people were being targeted, rightly or wrongly. Then they have another thing where in Amjad's bank account, there's $70,000 that came from Saudi Arabia. After 9/11, you think that's the handcuffs right there. But they didn't. But these things got on the record, Amjad and Aafia. And so clearly they were on the radar. Then what I didn't know until recently, I learned it from a fairly impeccable source, that some intelligence agent sitting in, some cave someplace pulls together something and says that here's Aafia Siddiqui is obviously the perfect profile of a Al-Qaeda attacker because, and this is what they say, she's got a PhD from MIT, right or wrong? It's wrong. She didn't have a PhD from MIT. Says that anyone who went to MIT has got to be a physicist, right or wrong?
Wrong, right?
It's just another university.
Yeah.
And therefore, she could be the next nuclear bomb builder.
Wow.
They then make the fabulous leap that she's going to be smuggled into the US by Al Qaeda, working with who?
Well, I saw that they tried to link her to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or something like that.
No, that comes later. No, this step of it, they thought Al Qaeda was going to be working with the Medellin drug cartel from Colombia.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, you really think whoever wrote that was probably got some of his source material from Colombia that he was smoking. Anyway, so she gets on their radar for that. And then something comes through the UN, which says that Aafia Siddiqui on June the 16th, 2001, was working on buying and selling blood diamonds for Al Qaeda in Liberia.
Wow.
Look, they just had to check her record. She was actually having a medical thing in Boston on that day. But somehow this got on the record. And this whole business of blood diamonds later became an issue because the FBI was embarrassed that they didn't know about it. So they sent 15 agents to Liberia. And they proved it was all total nonsense. The eyewitnesses said it wasn't Aafia and this, that, and the other. But again, bizarrely, this remained on her record, even though they debunked it themselves. Then along comes we get to 2003. Aafia is in Pakistan now. She and her husband have gone back there. It's been a very unpleasant time. Her husband shoved her father in September 2002, who fell and had a heart attack and died, and the family blames him, and her father had told her to divorce Amjad. So she was going through a very ugly divorce, and hell hath no fury as a husband scorned. he is questioned by local people and tries to say that everything that was on him was on her. So, this is just typical, isn't it? So then what happens on March the 18th, 2003, is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has now been detained. And as you know, he was the guy who was supposedly, he was boasting about being the brains behind 9/11. And at this point, the CIA are using waterboarding on him. They've done him, I think, 181 times. They've had him sleep deprived for over a week. And they're showing him and other people a picture book of different suspects. And there's only one woman in this. And for reasons that are related to Amjad and all that, it's Aafia. And so they're asking him under torture who's a big time Al Qaeda person. Now, this is where I've heard this from a couple of people. This is where some of these men saw this picture book and saw a woman and said, well, we can usefully snitch on her because no one's going to believe it because there's no women in Al Qaeda and they're never going to abuse her. So let's just make up a story about her. And so apparently KSM did that. And so this March the 18th, so 12 days later, March the 30th, 2003, the US has done what they did for more than half of the prisoners in Guantanamo, which is they'd paid bounties for them. And they'd paid President Pervez Musharraf's people huge amounts of money. In Aafia's case, it was apparently $55,000 for them to grab Aafia so that she can be put in the CIA detention. So she, on the morning of the 30th, is going to Islamabad and she's got a meeting in Islamabad about her educational ideas. And she's got her three children in tow, but she's now a single mother. And her three children are Amjad, age 6, Mariam, age 3, and Suleiman, age 6 months. And they take a taxi to the airport and they take a shortcut as they're a bit late. And this is something that Aafia really regrets, although I don't think it makes any difference. Because they're on a slightly dark road when these cars converge on them and stop them. And now obviously the CIA and the Pakistani government have lied about this, but we know it's true because we secretly recorded one of the officers who did it. And he tells us. And so what happens is they stop the car, they drag the kids out of the car. As they do this, apparently, and this has never been confirmed, apparently they drop Suleiman on his head and kill him. Now, we don't know if that's true. And he, Omar, have you got kids?
Yeah, yes, I do.
How
Two
old?
boys, 17 and 15.
17. Okay, imagine that you've got a kid 6 months old and you think he's dead, but you're not sure. 20 years goes by and you still don't know. Would you want closure? Would you want certainty? Or would you want to hold out the faint hope that he's still alive? Which would you want?
I don't. That's a hard question to ask. I mean, obviously, you want to probably hold out hope that the baby's alive, right? But you also want to know what's going on. Where is he? What? Is he okay?
Well, I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think the majority of people I asked that question to would actually like closure. But because 20 years on, you're a bit crazy to still have hope. But there's reason to have a bit of hope in Afia's case, and what this is true torture. But then there are other two kids, right? So Mariam, age
Mhm.
3, born in the USA, therefore a US citizen. The CIA takes her up to Kabul, 1,000 kilometers north, and forcibly adopts her into a white Christian American family on what I'm sure you'll agree is the obvious theory that a white Christian American is better off than a Pakistani Muslim of color, if they're superior human being on every level. I mean, it's just mad, right?
Right.
But then they rename her Fatima, and we know the names of the parents who were clearly in my investigation to CIA people. And she's held by them for 7 years, right? And the only reason she's ever released is because Fauzia does this fabulous digging and finally persuades Hamid Karzai, president of Afghanistan at the time, to help her get the daughter back. And, Karzai is now a witness to all of this. Unless the CIA thinks they can lie, he's said what really happened when he got her back and she was being
Hmm.
held by the CIA. So that's one that that's mad. But then you think about what happened to Ahmed, age 6, US citizen, taken by the CIA from Karachi to Kabul, where they put him in prison. He's an American child, and the
Wow.
CIA puts him in prison. What's wrong with these people? And they rename him Isan Ali, and they tell him if he ever says to anyone he's Ahmed, the son of Aafia, they'll kill him. Now, we need to have a hearing in Congress, obviously, because this is just utterly mad. And whoever made that decision has a lot to answer for. So he's there for 5 years, right? And then they take Aafia to Bagram Air Force Base, where they torture her for 5 years. I've been there. I've filmed everywhere where it happened. I've interviewed people who saw her there. I've, interviewed them there just so we can bring it all alive. And they're torturing her by having children in front of her through a one-way glass. She thinks they're torturing her children. And I talked to Aafia about this. What would you do if your kids were being tortured in front of you?
You would probably say or do anything they want you to get it to stop.
But then they won't stop. So what are you going to do next?
Yeah, I have no idea. That just
Yeah,
sounds like a very difficult situation.
I think you're using some British understatement there. It's a bit more difficult. So she told me that in the end, the only thing she could think of to try to stop this madness was to pretend she didn't care. Now, how difficult is that for someone? And, imagine the trauma of everything she's going through while she's being abused by these crazy people. And, again, the CIA obviously denies it and lies about it. But one of the things I've got here, it's actually interesting, is one of the things they made her do was write out that she could do this nuclear stuff, right? And it's total silliness. But she wrote something. This is another test of your physics, Omar. How do you shoot down a satellite? You know?
How do you down a satellite?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, actually. That's a very interesting question. I
Well,
think
think
maybe you can deprogram it from afar and maybe it'll get out of orbit or something like that.
about how you do it. So I'm not talking about how someone does. How would you do it?
You'd probably have to go to a command center wherever the satellites are controlled and like take that out, right? Something like that.
But I mean, do you feel confident that you could advise Al Qaeda on how to shoot down?
No, absolutely not. I'm just guessing, spitballing.
Well, what do they? Do you learn nothing there in Dallas? Do they teach you nothing about shooting and satellite? So look,
No.
on this page of a magazine, this
Uh-huh.
very page here that says, "Can we cure aging?"
Right.
She had Afia in her handwriting had written down how to shoot down a satellite, and this is presented as if she's really telling Al Qaeda that. Now, if I got a copy of this magazine because I thought we should take a close look at it, and if you turn it over to the page before,
Uh-huh.
it's an article called How to Kill a Satellite, which she
Interesting.
just copied out, right?
Uh-huh.
Now, the crucial thing about this magazine is it's only published in print and it's dated December 2007, right? So,
Very after the whole episode.
well, it's dated when she's in CIA custody in Baghdad. So there's only one way she could get her hands on that, right? And
Right.
what's
They
the
must have
only
given her the literature to look at, right?
they brought it to her. She couldn't otherwise have got it. It wasn't available in wasteland of Pakistan, Afghanistan, wherever else she was meant to be. So this is proof positive that they're lying. But there's lots more, okay? And what happened was they torture her for 5 years and then they work out what they so often did,
Hmm.
which is that she's really not the person they thought she was. So they want to get rid of her. Now, one of the things that happened a number of times in the cases I've worked on is when the CIA works out that it really made an embarrassing mistake, like Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, for example, who Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was taken by the CIA to Egypt, where they tortured him with electric cattle prods. And then he said that Saddam Hussein was in league with Al Qaeda on WMD, right? And then Colin Powell said that in the UN. It was one of the reasons we went to war in Iraq. And it turns out to be total. And that's really embarrassing. So he never showed up in Guantanamo Bay because that's just too embarrassing. He was sent to Libya where Gaddafi killed him. The same thing was happening to Aafia. When they decided they needed to get rid of her, they did what's called in the trade a disposal program. And normally, when the CIA wants to dispose of someone, they get someone else to do the dirty work, like they did with Sheikh al-Libi.
Hmm.
In this case, it was the Pakistanis. Now, you have to remember, we're now in July 2008. She's been tortured for 5 years. By now, she's really famous in Pakistan. Her sister ended up at one point having 1 million people on a march for Aafia Siddiqui. So Pervez Musharraf is now clinging on to power in Pakistan, and he doesn't want her back. So the ISI confect this plot to murder her. And what they do is they tell her in Kabul that if she goes to Ghazni, which is 150K southwest, she can have her daughter back and then she can go back to Pakistan. And they give her what they say is her son. Now, her son doesn't say he's Ahmed. He says he's Isan Ali because he's been so terrified by these people. She's wearing a full chador, so he can't even see if it's mum. So, but they both get in this bus and they travel to Ghazni. And this is July the 17th, 2008, middle of summer. And it's very hot. And the Pakistani ISI have dressed Ahmed up in a coat, a winter coat with four big pockets. And in each of the pockets, there's a big thing of fruit. And what does that make you think if you see some small boy with a big coat like that with big bulging things on the front? What's that meant to look like?
I don't know. It's very suspicious, right? I don't know if they think he's, yeah, I'm a little lost at words what that might be.
You don't have to be too lost for words. It's meant to be a suicide bomb. And Alfie is in a chador, so you can't see what she's got on underneath. And they tell her to go sit outside the Khalid bin Walid Mosque in Ghazni.
Oh,
And along with them in this bus is this Pakistani guy who's going to plant some evidence on her. And what's meant to happen? The Pakistanis, and we now can prove this, 2 days ahead of time, had called in a suicide bomb threat to Ghazni, said that this woman who's going to blow herself up outside a mosque. Now, the Afghan National Police, fortunately, are so incompetent that it took them 6 hours to find her. But she goes there and sits outside this mosque, which I've been to 3 times, and is waiting for her daughter. And sitting beside her is the boy, who's now 11. And they just sit there. And I went there. People said no one will remember it. You won't get any witnesses. I got to say, in 3 hours, I got 6 witnesses. And I've been back a couple of times since. They all saw her and they thought, this is weird. What's this woman doing? It's a male only mosque. And she was just sitting there for hours and she couldn't speak Farsi. She only spoke Urdu. And so no one could converse with her. Across the street was a tailor called Mohammed Ajmal Mohammadi. And Mohammadi had tailored in Pakistan, so he spoke Urdu. And he sees this woman, and after several hours, he decides it's getting dark. It's a war zone, but better do something about it. So he goes out there and he talks to her and says, you can stay at my mum's house, but I think you really got to go in. And she says, no, I can't. I'm just waiting for my daughter. And so they're in this conversation when the Afghan National Police show up. There are 40 of them with their AK-47s. And their standard operating procedure is they're just going to ring her and then shoot her. They're not going to take any risks, right?
right.
But Mohammadi stands in the way and says this woman is not a suicide bomber. So at that point, they run out and rip off her chador, discover the kid's got fruit in his pocket. And so they arrest her and they take her to the Afghan National Police headquarters in Ghazni. And she hasn't done anything wrong. According to them, her only crime is not to have a visa to be in Afghanistan, which is hardly her fault. So she's in the Afghan National Police headquarters, and the Americans hear that she's there. Oh my goodness. And they come rushing into Ghazni. And so they come to the ANP headquarters the next morning on the 18th, and they want the Afghans to let them have Afia back because obviously the plan hadn't gone right. The Afghans, to their credit, say, no, it's none of your business. We arrested her. But then the US does what the US does best and bribes the chief of police. So then he lets them in. And she's in a room which is about the same as my office here. It's about, maybe 20 feet long almost and 15 feet wide. And she's behind a curtain at one end on a bed. And she hears these American voices. And she thinks, oh my goodness, I'm going to be taken back for more torture. So she peeks around the curtain to see if there's an escape route. And one of the soldiers sees her and says, she's on the loose, and shoots her twice in the stomach. This is her version of
This
events.
was an American soldier or an Afghan soldier?
American soldier.
Okay.
The chief warrant officer shoots her with his pistol. So this is what she says, right? But what she says turns out to be true. The American soldiers then discover they've shot an unarmed woman, and oh my goodness, they're in trouble. They're going to get charged for this, right? So the thin line of the American military being what it is, they confect a lie. And they say that they came into the room, that the chief warrant officer put his M4 submachine gun on the ground, as one does in a war zone. And then she reached under the curtain, picked up the M4 rifle, flipped off the safety catch, and starts screaming and shooting at them. Now, my question for you, Omar, is this. And I'm afraid we're going to discover you're immensely ignorant again. It's shocking, you people in Delhi. You've got a Second Amendment. You should know this. Where is the safety catch on an M4 machine
I don't know too much about that, I'll be honest.
gun? Look, that's just shocking, isn't it? Well, neither did Aafia. She could no more have done that than you could. And the US, there are two holes in the wall behind where they were, and supposedly that's where the bullets went, right? Sounds a bit convincing. And it would be convincing if there were any truth to it. But one of the things that this is what was presented at trial to show that she was guilty of attempted murder of two federal officials. But unfortunately for the military, we now have a videotape that was taken earlier that day in the same room, which shows the two holes up there already, and they weren't bullet holes. Indeed, they dug out the holes and there were no bullets in them. There were no shell casings from them. There was no gunshot residue on Aafia or the curtain. There were no fingerprints on the gun. It's just nonsense, right? But the problem is she's taken urgently to Bagram for the hospital to patch her up because she's close to death. And then she's taken 10,000 miles to New York and put on trial, and she has no witnesses except herself. And all these military people come in. There's a fascinating thing where they bring in an Afghan interpreter who they promised a green card and all sorts of other stuff to, who sort of backs up their story. So the whole case is presented as only the military side of it. The jury doesn't hear anything else. They've chosen New York as the venue because the trial is happening, spitting distance from 9/11 at the World Trade Center. And the jury convicts them. And at that point, the judge, you'd normally get 7 or 10 years for attempted murder. The judge ends up giving her 86 years in prison. And she's taken to FMC Carswell, which is where you are, which is where you, incidentally, Omar, and all your fellows there have a duty to do something to straighten up that prison she's in. And she's taken there, where she's been now basically for 16 years. And she has been in administrative segregation the entire time. That is the harshest punishment that a female prisoner can have for 10,250 women in federal custody in America. And she's been in admin seg longer than anyone else, including the people on death row. So she's been treated worse than everyone else. She's been abused and sexually assaulted and all sorts of other stuff. They won't let her have Omar Suleiman. You probably know Omar. Do you know Omar?
Yeah, yep, I'm familiar with him.
Have you met him?
I haven't met him, but some of my friends know him pretty well.
Yeah, and if you do meet him, how tall are you?
I'm about 6'3".
Yeah, I'm 6'3". And
Okay.
there are very few people you and I look up to, but we look up to Omar because he's like 6'7".
Oh
And
wow.
he's a delightful guy, and he's a really decent person. And he agreed to go see Aafia to give her some Islamic religious solace. And the prison won't let him in. But they did let in the Christian minister who rapes him. And it's just, that prison so needs to be closed down. And, one of the reasons for it is this, that no one is keeping an eye on them. One time they made me wait an hour and a half when I was waiting to go in. So I took a look through their visiting log, and I discovered that I have visited personally, just me, all the way from England, Aafia as many times in a year as the rest of the American bar, a million lawyers, have visited the other 974 women who are held there, which means that there's nobody who's really keeping an eye on that place. And when you give that sort of power, it's got to be, regulated carefully, and it's not being regulated in FMC Carswell. And as a consequence, the abuse there is shocking. They have the highest sexual assault complaint rate of any prison in America. So, you've got to do something about it. And that's where Aafia is today. And we just got through trying to get clemency from Joe Biden, which is, if I dare say it, right, I'm still pretty steaming because we presented 76,600 word clemency petition that laid out a lot of what I've just said to you, including incredible abuse in prison. It was 11:45 on Monday the 20th. So Biden had 15 more minutes as president when people sent me a letter denying clemency without any reason. And the cynic in me says, well, the big reason is that she's not related to him. He just pardoned half of his family for things that they're in charge with. But I think this is a monstrous failing of the American system that he didn't give her clemency. And what we were going to do is just get her out of there, get her into hospital in another country, and get her the treatment she needs for what she's been through. And instead, now we've just got to go through Plan B, Plan C, Plan D. We'll get her out one day. I rest assured, I'm not going to stop till we do. But it's just shocking.
So is it unusual that they actually denied the clemency, or would it have been possible that they just didn't respond? I mean, was either one a possibility, or is denial like a worse thing? Or
so they actively took the position of denying. I don't think it's an impossible thing for Trump to do the right thing, because do you know who I mean by Shaquille Afridi?
I've heard the name. I believe he was one of the people that the U.S. used in the vaccine scheme when they're trying to catch OBL many years ago.
Yeah, that's true. So he's currently in prison in Pakistan and not being treated well at all. And, America has a history of helping out the people who help them, because if you don't, they won't help you again in the future. So I do think it's more likely that we'll get Donald Trump to get Shaquille Afridi out on a swap for Aafia than that we'd be able to do it with Biden, because it's like Nixon going to China, right? I mean, it's where the Republicans have the courage to do things that benefits them. So, I hope that's a possibility. I hold out hope to swap Aafia for Imran Khan too, but that's just because me and Imran go back a long way. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I know. I saw that Imran Khan had raised, when he was in power, he had raised the issue of a swap for Aafia Siddiqui back then. And I don't know if Trump was in power then, but I feel like he gets along well with Trump. So maybe, with Trump, you have to assuage his ego a little bit. So maybe that's the best way to deal with him, is just to kind of pump him up a little bit.
Well, I do think, yeah, I was not representing Aafia there. And, I've known Imran for 20 years and I consider him a friend. And I just wish I'd been involved then because, he and I would have had a chat and we'd have worked this out. But unfortunately, that wasn't. But we still got a chance to do something along those lines. And if that doesn't work, we go to court and we have a 3-week evidentiary hearing where I get ISI agents who have talked to me. I get Hamid Karzai. I get, the recordings of the agents who kidnapped these kids. I get intelligence agents in America, all to tell us the truth about what happened. And seriously, if the CIA and the ISI want to have a 3-week public hearing in New York City, bring it on. I'm looking forward to that. And I think there will come a time when so much of their dirty laundry gets exposed.
So what do you think the people that are listening to this and anyone else who's interested, how can they help with the case? Getting awareness is a big deal, but is there anything else people can do?
Well, yeah, there are lots. I mean, first, I would like you to be pretty angry at your government if you're American, you and I. I think what we need to do is start contacting legislative representatives. I spent 10 days in December and another week in January crawling around Congress, meeting with a bunch of people, both Democrats and Republicans, because I want a hearing in Congress about what was done, particularly to those two little American children who were abducted and basically sold into slavery by the Americans. CIA. They just lost the plot. That is total madness. And we need to know the truth on that, because otherwise that sort of thing will happen again. But then, look, the next thing you got to do is that every Saturday or so, there's a demonstration outside FMC Carswell. The reason that's important is because Aafia hears it, right? When those people are outside Carswell, she hears them chanting her name. You got to remember that this is not about a theory. It's not about a principle. It's about a human being. And so there are several things you can do for Aafia. One is that. Another is that people can write to her. And the email address that you can write to, which is one that comes to me, is lettersforaafia@gmail.com. That's letters, Letters, the number 4, and then Aafia, Aafia, @gmail.com. And if you send that to me, I then cut and paste it. It's got to be in English, otherwise they won't let it in. But I cut and paste it into a legal letter from me to Aafia. And I send her 100 pages of nice things that people write to her every 2 or 3 weeks. And don't pity her. She doesn't want to be pitied. The thing that gives her courage is when people write to her about how they've heard her story. It's a miracle that she's still alive and kicking, and that she's an inspiration. Now, if you write that to her, that encourages her. So I want as many people who listen to this as possible to do that. And then, you can support us in other ways. Omar, what's your profession when you're not making
No, I'm a
podcasts?
physician.
There you go. You see, we need physicians, and I thought that was the case. And so for example, challenging the prison, they won't let us have an independent doctor in. Now, I got one in because we got a Pakistan government delegation to come, and I made sure that Dr. Iqbal Afridi was part of that delegation. He was the leading Pakistan psychiatrist who evaluated and treated Aafia's children when they were released from Afghanistan. And so he went in and he got to do an evaluation of Aafia. Imperfect, because it wasn't, the way a doctor would like to do that. But we got to get doctors. I've been trying to get Muslim American doctors in to see her because she's not getting health care. To get any sort of care, she has to go through a strip search. How do you feel if your patients, when they come to your hospital, you tell them, look, man, before I'm going to give you any medical care, I'm going to have you stripped, and they're going to feel around you, and there'll be people watching. How many patients would you have?
0.
Yeah, 0. Of course, it's disgusting. So this is the sort of sexual humiliation that's inflicted on her, and she's missing all her teeth on one level. She can't get that. That's when they hit her in Afghanistan, not now. She's deaf in one ear because of the beatings. She's got all sorts of other physical ailments. We got to get medical professionals in. So we want people like you, Omar, or Dr. Omar, I will refer to you right here, to get your medical professionals to sign up with us to complain to that prison. I want you to get me 100 doctors who say you can't do this shit. And then next, I want people who attend your mosques to complain to the prison, and you can just complain directly to the warden. It's on the website. But you can also go over his head and complain to the Bureau of Prisons. I can give you Colette Peters, the head of the Bureau of Prisons, her email. And you complain to them about the fact that they're trampling on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act by not allowing Omar Suleiman in there and refusing to give him a reason. I mean, this delightful guy who offers to do it for nothing, they just refuse and won't say why. And you know why it is, right? It's
Yeah.
because he's a decent man who stands up for human rights, and they don't like that. So you got to complain about that, and you want to have your representative do something about that. And then you can think about the senators who send their people into prisons to see what's going on there. I talked to some senators, staff in Washington just a couple of weeks ago about going down and demanding to come in to see what's happening to Aafia in that prison. They'll wake those people up. And you got to make that a cause. You've got to be complaining to your representatives and senators there in Texas, saying that we want an inspection of this. And then there is no talent that I can't exploit. I hate to tell you this so much, but we need help in so many different levels. Even, for example, this really nice chap contacted me about, he's an engineer. So I had him review some of the nonsense that were used against Aafia at trial and just give me a sworn declaration about whether this made any scientific sense at all. And it doesn't. So, there's no one out there who doesn't have a role to play in this. And you know what? Here's where I threaten you with eternal damnation. If you do the right thing, you get to go to heaven. If you don't, I'm sorry, but it's hellfire. So,
No, I like that. So one question I have is, I know you mentioned prominently her children in the episode. Do you have any update on the whereabouts or the condition of her two, possibly three children?
yeah, well, I do too. And I know them. I've met them on my travels because Fausia managed to rescue. So 5 years was what Ahmed spent at prison, and then 7 years is what Mariam spent with the American family. And then Fausia managed to get him back. And Fausia, one of the amazing things about her is essentially as what is effectively a single parent. She has raised four children of her own and two children of Aafia's. And to immense effect, Ahmed, who's a lovely lad, he's 26, 27 now, and he's a qualified doctor in Karachi. And Fausia has made that happen. Mariam, who herself went to medical school with the avowed intent of being qualified as a doctor so she can help her mum when her mother gets out. She's just got a few more months to go. I think she's just taking her final exams now, and she'll be qualified. So these kids have done amazingly well, but they're very traumatized by what they went through. And while they carry American passports, they're afraid of coming to America. And there's something deeply disturbing that they can't do that. And so, again, we need the good people of Dallas Fort Worth to let themselves be heard on this. That honestly, I want them invited, specially by the Senate, to come to America, and under total protection of the Texas senator, so that they can tell their story if they're willing to, and so that they can overcome their fear of their own country, a fear that's engendered by the CIA. Now, the CIA, we're not out to get the CIA, right? I'm not someone who sends people to prison. I'm not interested in that. We're out simply to have the truth. Truth and reconciliation is a really good concept. It worked well in South Africa. It works for me every time. So I just want the CIA and the ISI, for that matter, to know I'm not out to get them. But the longer this goes on, the more trouble they're going to be in, because they force me, as Aafia's lawyer, to expose their wrongdoing. And there's going to be someone one day who's going to be so angry at them that they'll end up being prosecuted. But it would be far better if we just reached an agreement and didn't have to do that.
I appreciate you spending the time and telling us about Aafia's story and what people can do. Anywhere where people can follow you online or contact if they have any, like where they can follow you.
Well, I'm on what I refuse to call X, but it's called Twitter, as Clive S. Smith. And I try to keep people updated that way. My nonprofit is it's Justice League, so it's www.justiceleague.org.uk. We're a nonprofit, so people are always welcome to donate to it. But I don't do this for money. I don't obviously charge Aafia. So, and then you're welcome to give them my email address if anyone wants to. Then contact me. It's clive@justiceleague.org.uk. And anyone who's got questions or who wants to do something helpful is very, very welcome to contact.
Well, no, I appreciate it, and I think it's pretty admirable that you've kind of dedicated your life to defeating the death penalty, human rights for prisoners who probably wouldn't otherwise get them in like Guantanamo or in the case of Aafia. So appreciate all the work you do, and thank you for your time.
There's absolutely nothing. I have to because my mother, who's looking down on me from heaven, I would be really annoyed if I didn't do it. So, and it's a great privilege. Nothing gives me greater joy than being able to bring power to powerless people. And it's one of the miracles of the American Constitution. And it's our duty to do that if we're going to fulfill that Constitution.
All right. Well, thank you very much again, and appreciate everything.
All right, Emma, thanks very much. Bye.
All right. Take care. That's all. Thank you for listening to the show. And please, if you liked it, leave a review and a rating, like and subscribe to help others find the show. Until next time, I'm out.